3.5 years ago, nearly 200 people were killed in the city of Madrid by a series of bombs that exploded on crowded commuter trains. Now a Spanish court is set to deliver a verdict on 28 suspects who most assume were linked to Al-Qaeda in Europe and driven by the Spanish government's support of the Iraq war. But as Al Jazeera's Laurence has found, some key players have a very different view.
3 years since Atocha Station and almost 200 dead. But still, it's hard to forget some of the defining images from that time. Of the shock in Spain that this could happen here. Of Aznar lining up with Bush and Blair in the Azores, despite massive opposition to the war in his country. Of the millions who protested the bombings and the war. And of the suicides of those surrounded by the police. But while the apartment has been rebuilt, many opinions here remain unreconstructed.
It's pretty much universally assumed that the people who blew themselves up here were Muslim radicals acting on behalf of Al-Qaeda in Europe, and that the bombings were a response to the Iraq war. And yet, some 3 years after the bombings, if you speak to some key opinion formers in Madrid, you'd be forgiven for thinking that there was an entirely different agenda in play.
Take, for instance, the man who was and still is Aznar's foreign policy advisor, and who still insists the bombings were nothing to do with Spain's support for the Iraq war.
I think that this is the radical Islamist ideology, the jihadist terrorism that has nothing to do with Islam, that has taken Islam hostage, that has twisted the real message of moderate Islam, and trying to justify its unjustifiable actions with any kind of excuse.
And what about in the mosque, where they freely admit to helping the police by keeping an eye on people with extreme religious devotion? Here too they don't blame it on the war, but on local mafia of Muslims and non-Muslims.
The majority of them are in drugs, prostitution, and common criminal people.
The lawyers of some of the accused believe other conspiracies. With the prime suspects dead, they say, the politicians and the police went after anyone they could, even people with the most circumstantial links, like this man who worked in a chip factory in Brussels and who's been facing a 1,000-year jail term.
The main suspects died, and from that point there was a political and social clamour to find someone to answer for the attacks. The police, not having the main authors of the attacks, looked for people who had had contact with the so-called perpetrators.
Even if there's a myriad of theories, life for North Africans in Madrid has changed radically, and only for the worse.
You go to find a flat and they're afraid to rent it to you. You go to the metro with a rucksack and they're always scared of you. You look for a job and it's always difficult. You can get work, but it's usually the job Spanish people don't want to do.
The memorial to the dead receives regular visiting groups, and probably for most Spanish people, the long-term emotion is sadness. But with opinions so divided, hope that this case could draw a line under things is probably over-optimistic. Laurence, Al Jazeera in Madrid.